Shadow Empire, Resurrected, Rome. Chapter 1. The Shadows Rise. The first sign that the world was about to change forever came not with fanfare or declaration, but with a simple power outage in Geneva at 3:47 a.m. on March 15, 2030. Dr. Sarah Chen was working late in her office at the World Economic Forum when the lights flickered and died. Through her window, she watched the city plunge into darkness, block by block, like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. Her secure satellite phone buzzed once before going silent. In Beijing, London, Washington, D.C., and Moscow, similar blackouts were beginning. What Dr. Chen couldn't know was that 50 floors below her, in a bunker that didn't appear on any building schematic, Marcus Valerius sat before a wall of quantum displays showing the globe in real time. Red dots pulsed across every continent as his operatives activated protocols that had been decades in the making. "Initiate Phase 1, he spoke into a secure communicator, his voice carrying the authority of ancient patrician bloodlines and modern technological power. Across the world, men and women who had spent years climbing the ranks of governments, militaries, and corporations suddenly shed their carefully maintained facades. General Harrison Webb, trusted commander of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division, turned his troops toward Washington instead of their scheduled training exercise. In the basement of the Pentagon, Colonel Maria Santos disabled the primary defense grid while her hand-picked team secured the nuclear command center. Within hours, similar scenes played out on every continent. The Chinese PLA's Northern Command mysteriously redirected toward Beijing under orders from General Liu Wei, a man whose loyalty the party had never questioned. In London, MI6 Director James Blackwood personally led a team to Downing Street, carrying arrest warrants bearing seals that no one recognized but somehow seemed ancient and legitimate. The beauty of Umbra Imperium's plan was its simplicity disguised as chaos. For generations, they had placed their people, trained from birth in the old ways, but educated in the new technologies. They were ghosts hiding in plain sight. Senators, generals, CEOs, and scientists who had one true allegiance hidden beneath layers of fabricated loyalty. In Moscow, President Volkov's secure bunker became his tomb when his own security detail, led by Deputy Director Alexei Romanov, sealed the blast doors. The official story would blame a tragic malfunction. In Brasilia, President Santos found himself facing his own Air Force commander at gunpoint, forced to sign documents transferring emergency powers to a temporary military council filled with men whose names appeared on no public roster. Not all transitions were so clean. British Prime Minister Davidson fought back, triggering alarms and barricading himself in the crisis room beneath Whitehall. But even his most trusted bodyguards had been compromised. The brief firefight lasted only minutes before silence returned to the corridors of power. The technological warfare was equally decisive. Umbra Imperium's quantum computers, hidden in server farms disguised as commercial data centers, had been infiltrating global networks for years. They didn't just shut down communications, they rewrote them. Emergency broadcasts now carried new frequencies. Financial markets displayed fabricated data, and military communication channels rerouted through their control systems. Dr. Chen, still trapped in her darkened office, finally managed to reach her emergency radio. The static-filled voice that emerged spoke in measured tones about temporary security measures and coordinated international cooperation to address the crisis. But something in the careful pronunciation, the formal cadence, reminded her of classical Latin texts she'd studied in university. As dawn broke over Rome, Marcus Valerius received the final confirmation. Every major government was either controlled or neutralized. Every nuclear weapon was under their command. The quantum communication network that had replaced the old internet was theirs to control. The ancient family's investment in cutting-edge technology had paid the ultimate dividend: absolute power. He stepped onto the balcony of his private residence overlooking the Tiber and smiled. In 12 hours, the world would learn that the Roman Empire had never truly fallen. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to reclaim its destiny. The eagles would fly again, but this time they would never fall. The Age of Eagles was about to begin. Chapter 2. The Resurrection. 12 hours after the world had gone dark, it blazed to life again, but under new management. Marcus Aurelius Maximus emerged from the restored Pantheon in Rome as the first rays of sunrise painted the ancient dome gold. The building itself had been secretly reconstructed over the past decade, its classical exterior hiding quantum processing cores and holographic projection systems that now displayed the imperial eagles soaring in perpetual flight above the rotunda. The man who would be emperor wore a toga of deep purple silk, interwoven with threads of programmable fiber optics that pulsed with the heartbeat of the nascent empire. At his side hung not a gladius, but a ceremonial staff topped with a crystalline orb containing the quantum key to every military system on Earth. "Citizens of the world," his voice echoed from every functioning screen, speaker, and device across 6 continents. The words came simultaneously in 47 languages, each perfectly synchronized by the AI translation matrix that had learned every nuance of human speech. "I am Marcus Aurelius Maximus, heir to the greatest civilization mankind has ever known, and I speak to you now as your emperor." The reactions were as varied as they were futile. In New York, crowds gathered in Times Square, some in disbelief, others in rage. A few protesters tried to storm the building housing the nearest Umbra Imperium command center, only to find their path blocked by columns of metallic figures that moved with inhuman precision. The robotic legions had been activated sleek humanoid forms clad in armor that mimicked classical Roman design, while housing advanced weaponry and shield generators. In Tokyo, Prime Minister Tanaka, one of the few leaders who had survived the night, by virtue of being already in Umbra Imperium's pocket, formally announced Japan's transition to provincial status. "The Empire of Japan," he declared with practiced solemnity, "recognizes the wisdom of unity under the restored Roman Empire. We shall be honored to serve as the province of Nippon." Similar declarations followed in rapid succession. President Brown of the Council of the European Union, flanked by the robotic centurions who had escorted him to Brussels, proclaimed the establishment of the provinces of Gallia, Germania, and Hispania. The hastily assembled interim governments of Britain, now Britannia, and the former United States, redesignated as Colombia, followed suit within the hour. But resistance sparked in unexpected places. In Lagos, Governor Adebayo refused the surrender terms and barricaded himself with loyal forces in the government complex. His defiance lasted exactly 17 minutes before orbital bombardment from a previously unknown satellite network reduced the building to rubble. The message was clear. Cooperation was preferred but not required. In Berlin, Chancellor Müller attempted to rally the European defense forces, only to discover that half his generals were already wearing the purple sash of Roman allegiance. The brief civil conflict that erupted in the Brandenburg Gate Plaza ended when the robotic legions demonstrated their energy shields, deflecting tank shells as if they were raindrops. The surviving German forces laid down their arms within hours. Australia presented a different challenge entirely. Prime Minister Brooks, isolated by geography and warned by the fate of other resistors, attempted a desperate gambit. He destroyed key infrastructure and communication hubs, hoping to make the continent too costly to control. The Emperor's response was swift and merciless. A fleet of the strange aircraft descended upon major cities, deploying nanite clouds that rebuilt the destroyed systems within days, but this time under direct imperial control. The most poignant surrender came from Switzerland. President Hoffmann, speaking from the same Geneva building where Dr. Chen had witnessed the beginning of the end, delivered his capitulation in 3 languages. "The Swiss Confederation," he said, his voice breaking, "has always valued neutrality. Today, we discover that neutrality is a luxury the world can no longer afford." Behind him, holographic standards bearing the Golden Eagle replaced the Swiss cross on government buildings. The technological demonstration that followed was as much art as intimidation. Holographic eagles, each the size of a city block, materialized above every major urban center. They soared through the sky with wings that caught and reflected the sun, casting shadows that spelled out SPQR across plazas and parks. Children pointed in wonder while their parents stared in numb recognition that their world had fundamentally changed. But it was the smaller details that truly drove home the scope of the transformation. Traffic lights worldwide now pulsed with the imperial purple. Currency markets displayed new exchange rates against something called imperial ore. Weather reports included notices about atmospheric modification for imperial agricultural optimization. Even streaming services had been updated with new content categories: imperial history and citizenship preparation. Dr. Chen, finally freed from her darkened office, stood among the crowds in Geneva's main square watching the aerial display. The eagles moved with such fluid grace that for a moment she forgot they weren't real. But the resonance detectors in her lab coat pocket confirmed what her eyes suspected. These were constructs of pure energy, projected by technology that made her own cutting-edge research seem primitive. Around her, people spoke in hushed tones, some weeping, others laughing hysterically, a few already discussing how they might benefit from the new order. "The provincial governors will be announced within 72 hours, the emperor's voice continued, emanating from the eagles themselves. "Until then, all existing laws remain in effect under the authority of the empire. Resistance will be met with absolute force. Cooperation will be rewarded with peace and prosperity. Remember, you are no longer citizens of failed nation-states. You are Romans now." As the holographic display faded, real aircraft appeared on the horizon, sleek vessels that combined the aesthetic of Roman galleys with the technology of spacecraft. They moved in perfect formation, their hulls bearing the golden eagles and SPQR insignia that would soon become as familiar as the rising sun. The old world had ended not with nuclear fire or economic collapse, but with the calculated precision of an organization that had spent generations preparing for this single moment. The Roman Empire had returned, and this time it commanded technologies that the ancient Caesars could never have imagined. Marcus Aurelius Maximus smiled as he watched his new dominion from the steps of the Pantheon. The hardest part was over. Now came the truly challenging work: ruling the world. Chapter 3. Iron Rule Established. 5 years had passed since the resurrection, and the world had learned to live under the eagle's shadow, or had been eliminated for refusing to try. Emperor Marcus Aurelius Maximus ruled from the Palatine Complex, a sprawling technological marvel that had grown around the ancient ruins of Rome like a chrome and marble cancer. The complex housed not just the imperial residence, but the quantum processing cores that monitored every citizen, analyzed every communication, and predicted every potential threat to the empire's stability. Dr. Sarah Chen, now bearing the designation Citizen Scientist Class 7, tattooed in elegant script on her left wrist, hurried through the corridors of the Geneva Research Institute. The building had been renamed the Helvetica Provincial Scientific Academy, but the fear that permeated its halls remained unchanged. 3 of her former colleagues had vanished in the night over the past year, their crime nothing more than asking uncomfortable questions about the Empire's genetic modification programs. The classification system had become the backbone of imperial society. Citizens were categorized by bloodline, with those claiming Roman ancestry receiving preferential treatment, though genetic testing had to confirm their claims. Below them came the citizen workers, assigned to specialized tasks based on aptitude tests administered by AI systems that seemed to know more about a person's capabilities than they knew themselves. At the bottom were the provincial residents, those who had resisted too long or whose skills were deemed unnecessary. They lived in designated sectors, their movements tracked by subcutaneous chips that made escape impossible. The transformation of daily life had been swift and absolute. Every morning, citizens received their daily assignments through neural implants that had become mandatory within the first year of imperial rule. The implants, disguised as health monitoring devices, allowed the empire to track location, vital signs, and even emotional states. Elevated stress levels triggered automatic investigation. Patterns of behavior that deviated from approved norms resulted in educational sessions that few discussed afterward. London, now Londinium. Capital of Britannia. Province exemplified the empire's architectural philosophy. Ancient Roman designs had been rebuilt using materials that changed color based on the emperor's mood, broadcast from the Palatine complex. When Marcus Aurelius was pleased, the buildings glowed warm gold. When he was angry, they turned blood red. The psychological effect was profound. Citizens learned to read the city's hue like a barometer of their safety. The resistance movements that had sprouted in the early years had been crushed with methodical precision. The empire's predictive algorithms, fed by constant surveillance data, could identify potential dissidents months before they took action. The Praetorian Guard, enhanced with genetic modifications that made them faster, stronger, and utterly loyal, would arrive at a suspect's home with arrest warrants that cited crimes not yet committed, but statistically certain to occur. Marcus Wei, formerly a professor of political science at Beijing University, now served as a street sweeper in the Sina province. His crime had been publishing a paper titled Historical Parallels in Authoritarian Transitions, a work that had been flagged by the AI censors as containing seditious comparative analysis. He pushed his cart through the perpetually clean streets of New Beijing, where holographic dragons intertwined with Roman eagles in displays of cultural synthesis that felt more like mockery than respect. The genetic modification programs had produced results that would have been impossible under the old world's ethical constraints. The Praetorian Guard represented the pinnacle of human enhancement soldiers who could survive injuries that would kill normal humans, whose reflexes operated faster than thought, and whose loyalty had been literally coded into their DNA. But they were only the beginning. In the deep laboratories beneath the Palatine complex, teams of scientists worked on Project Aquila, the creation of a new ruling class. These enhanced humans would possess not just physical superiority, but cognitive abilities that surpassed any natural genius. They would be the emperor's administrators, governors, and eventual successors, bred specifically to rule over the unmodified masses. The empire's technological surveillance network had evolved beyond even the founder's original vision. Quantum-entangled particles in the atmosphere could detect conversations from orbit. Micro-drones the size of insects swarmed through cities, their sensors recording everything from facial expressions to pheromone levels. The very air had become an extension of the imperial intelligence apparatus. Dr. Chen paused at her laboratory window, watching a group of children in the plaza below. They wore the gray uniforms of the Imperial Youth Corps, their movements synchronized as they practiced ceremonial drills. These children had been born into the empire. They knew no other world. To them, the constant surveillance was normal. The classification system was natural, and the emperor's absolute authority was as fundamental as gravity. The children's instructor, a young woman with the bearing of a former military officer, led them through recitations of imperial doctrine. "The empire is eternal," their voices chimed in unison. "The emperor is infallible. Resistance is futile. Service is honor." The words echoed off the plaza's acoustically designed walls, carrying clearly to Chen's window 6 floors above. But it was the children's faces that haunted her, not because they showed fear or rebellion, but because they showed genuine contentment. This generation would grow up believing that freedom was chaos, that democracy was inefficiency, and that the empire's iron control was actually liberation from the uncertainties of choice. The economic system had been restructured around imperial priorities. The concept of private property had been replaced with imperial allocations. Citizens could use resources, homes, and even personal items, but ultimate ownership rested with the state. This system eliminated homelessness and poverty by fiat, but it also eliminated the possibility of accumulating independent wealth that might fund resistance. Currency had been replaced entirely with a social credit system that tracked not just purchases, but the political reliability of every transaction. Buying too many books resulted in a lower score. Associating with former dissidents lowered one's rating. Perfect compliance was rewarded with better housing, improved food rations, and access to entertainment districts where citizens could enjoy carefully curated pleasures. The irony was not lost on Chen that the empire had achieved many of the goals that democratic governments had struggled with for decades. Crime was virtually non-existent, not because social problems had been solved, but because the surveillance state made criminal activity impossible to hide. Environmental damage had been reversed through massive technological interventions, though at the cost of personal freedoms that previous generations had considered fundamental rights. As night fell over Geneva, the city's mood lighting shifted to the soft purple that indicated imperial satisfaction. Citizens began their evening routines, knowing that their compliance would be monitored and scored. In apartments across the city, families gathered for meals that were nutritionally optimized but emotionally hollow, their conversations carefully modulated to avoid triggering the listening devices they pretended not to notice. Dr. Chen returned to her work, analyzing atmospheric data for the Empire's weather modification program. The irony that she was helping to perfect the very technology that kept her imprisoned was not lost on her. But like billions of others, she had made the calculation that survival required collaboration, even as it slowly eroded the soul. Outside her window, the holographic eagles soared through the night sky, their wings cutting through the darkness like searchlights, a constant reminder that the Empire watched everything, controlled everything, and would tolerate nothing less than absolute submission. Chapter 4. The Heir's Burden. 23 years into the reign of Marcus Aurelius Maximus, the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill housed a secret that would reshape the empire. His son was nothing like him. Gaius Justinian Aurelius stood at the window of his private study, watching the morning rituals in the plaza below. Citizens moved in orderly streams to their assigned workstations, their gray uniforms marking their classifications as clearly as ancient Roman togas had once distinguished senator from plebeian. At 19, Gaius possessed the genetic enhancements that made him faster and stronger than ordinary humans, but it was his unmodified heart that set him apart from the imperial lineage. The transformation had begun in his earliest memories, though he hadn't understood it then. While other children of the imperial household were raised by AI tutors programmed with perfect pedagogical algorithms, Gaius had been assigned a human caretaker, a decision his father would later regret. Helena Vasquez had been a literature professor at the University of Madrid before the conquest. Her crime had been writing poetry that the imperial censors deemed emotionally subversive, verses that spoke of human dignity and the beauty of choice. Rather than execution, she had been sentenced to serve the imperial household, and after several years of proving her alliance to the empire, she was selected as a suitable candidate for caring for the heir's intellectual development. The emperor had viewed this assignment as a form of poetic justice, forcing a former advocate of freedom to raise the future embodiment of absolute power. He had not anticipated that Helena's influence would flow both ways. "Tell me again about the schools," Gaius said to Helena as she entered his study carrying the morning briefings. At 64, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate the palace's dangers through decades of observation. Her hair, now silver, was pulled back in the simple style mandated for palace staff, but her eyes still held the fire that had once inspired students to think beyond approved boundaries. "Which schools, young master?" Helena asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. It had become their daily ritual, his questions about the world that had existed before the eagles returned. The ones where children chose what to learn, where they asked questions that had no predetermined answers. Gaius turned from the window, his enhanced features bearing an expression that would have alarmed his father. There was compassion there, and curiosity about perspectives other than his own. Helena set down the briefings and moved to the shelf where she kept the few personal items she had been permitted to retain. Hidden behind volumes of approved imperial history was a worn photograph, her third-grade class, from 2029. 30 children of every ethnicity and background, their faces bright with the unguarded enthusiasm that had been systematically bred out of imperial youth. "They were called public schools," she said, her voice carrying the weight of careful practice. Even after all these years, certain topics required delicate handling. Children learned together regardless of their family's status. They studied art and music alongside mathematics and science. They were encouraged to disagree with their teachers, to question authority, to imagine different ways of living. Gaius studied the photograph with the intensity he had once reserved for military tactics. And they were happy? Some were. Some weren't. That was part of what made them human. Helena's words carried layers of meaning that 2 decades of shared conversations had taught them both to navigate. Happiness imposed from above is different from happiness chosen freely. The irony of their relationship was not lost on either of them. Helena had been assigned to ensure Gaius's loyalty to the imperial system, but her very presence had made him question that system's foundations. The emperor, focused on external threats and internal administration, had failed to notice that his heir was receiving an education in empathy from a woman who remembered when empathy was not a crime. Gaius's formal education had proceeded along traditional lines. The finest military strategists in the empire had taught him the art of war. Economic advisors had explained the efficiency of imperial resource allocation. Political theorists had demonstrated the superiority of absolute rule over the chaos of democracy. He had excelled in every subject, his enhanced cognitive abilities allowing him to master complex concepts with ease. But it was Helena's informal lessons that had shaped his character. She had taught him to see beyond statistics to the individual lives they represented. When efficiency reports showed a 12% increase in agricultural production in Gallia province, Helena would quietly mention that this meant families were eating better. Children were growing stronger. When security briefings noted the elimination of a resistance cell in Columbia province, she would remind him that those were human beings who had died, regardless of their politics. The transformation had been gradual but profound. Where his father saw subjects to be managed, Gaius began to see people with hopes and fears. Where the imperial system demanded absolute loyalty, Gaius wondered about the value of freely given allegiance. Where tradition insisted on the divine right of Caesars, Gaius questioned whether power should serve those who wielded it or those who lived under it. His father had begun to notice the changes by Gaius's 16th birthday. During a routine briefing about provincial unrest, Gaius had asked why the citizens were unhappy if imperial rule was truly superior. The emperor's response had been swift and harsh, a reminder that questioning imperial authority, even from the heir, bordered on treason. "Power, my son, is not about making people happy," Marcus Aurelius had said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "It is about maintaining order, ensuring stability, and preserving civilization. The weak desire happiness. The strong accept responsibility." But Gaius had seen Helena's subtle flinch at those words, and he had understood that strength might be defined differently than his father believed. The tension between father and son had grown more pronounced as Gaius entered adulthood. His military training had been exemplary. He could lead troops with tactical brilliance and inspire loyalty through personal charisma. His understanding of imperial administration was comprehensive. He grasped the complex systems that kept a world-spanning empire functioning. But his heart remained unconvinced that efficiency and order were worth the price being paid. Helena had never directly criticized the empire in their conversations. She was too intelligent to commit such obvious treason and too caring to put Gaius in an impossible position. Instead, she had shared tales of her students who had become doctors to help others rather than for status, artists who had created beauty for its own sake, families who had made sacrifices for love rather than duty. "What happened to them?" Gaius asked, referring to the children in the photograph. "Your students?" Helena's face grew still, the careful mask she had perfected over decades of survival. Many adapted well to imperial structure. They found purpose in their assigned roles, contentment in their allocated lives. The empire has been generous to those who embraced its vision. The words were safe, approved exactly what any monitoring system would expect to hear. But Gaius had learned to read the spaces between Helena's words, the subtle inflections that carried deeper meaning. Some had died in the resistance. Others had fled to the outer provinces. A few had simply disappeared into the vast machinery of the state, their individual voices lost in the collective chorus of compliance. As evening approached, Gaius prepared for the formal dinner where he would sit at his father's right hand, displaying the perfect demeanor of an imperial heir. He would discuss military campaigns with visiting generals, economic policies with provincial governors, and cultural initiatives with the artistic directors who shaped approved entertainment. He would be everything his position demanded. But afterward he would return to his study and stand at the window, looking out at the city below. He would wonder about the individual lives hidden behind the orderly facades, the dreams that were never spoken, the hopes that were carefully contained within acceptable boundaries. And he would think about Helena's stories of a world where children could choose their own paths, where questions were encouraged rather than feared, where strength was measured not by the ability to command, but by the willingness to serve. The burden of future power weighed heavily on his shoulders, but it was the burden of conscience that truly shaped him. In 23 years, when fate would call him to rule, he would carry both his father's legacy and Helena's teachings. The question that haunted his nights was which would prove stronger when the time came to choose between the empire's demands and humanity's needs. Helena entered the study one final time before retiring, carrying the evening reports that would detail the day's successes in maintaining imperial order. As she placed them on his desk, her hand briefly touched his shoulder, a gesture that would have been severely punished if observed by security systems, but which had become their ritual of mutual understanding. "Tomorrow will bring new challenges, young master," she said, her voice carrying the formal tone required of servants. "Yes," Gaius replied, understanding both the surface meaning and the deeper message. "Tomorrow I will need to be strong." They both knew that strength, when his time came, would be defined not by his father's example, but by the choice between ruling through fear and leading through love. The empire awaited its future Caesar, unaware that Helena Vasquez, a condemned poet from Madrid, had already begun shaping the man who would transform their world. Chapter 5. Ascension and Early Reforms. The death of Marcus Aurelius Maximus came without warning on a winter morning in the 27th year of his reign. The official cause was listed as cardiac failure, though whispers in the palace suggested that even genetically enhanced hearts could not withstand the weight of absolute power indefinitely. Within hours, the quantum communication networks that bound the empire together carried a single, simultaneous message to every corner of the world. The eagle has fallen. Long live the eagle. Gaius Justinian Aurelius, now 31 years old and bearing the enhanced physiology that made him appear closer to 25, stood in the Pantheon where his father had first declared the empire's resurrection. The same holographic eagles that had announced the conquest now bore witness to the transition of power. But where his father had worn robes that pulsed with technological dominance, Gaius chose simpler attire, purple silk, without fiber optics, a golden circlet instead of a crown embedded with quantum processors. The assembled Senate, a body that had served as little more than ceremonial validation for the previous emperor's decrees, waited in nervous silence. These men and women had spent decades perfecting the art of enthusiastic agreement. They had learned to read the subtle signs of imperial mood, to anticipate desires before they were spoken, to eliminate any trace of independent thought from their deliberations. Now they faced an unknown quantity in their new ruler. Helena stood among the palace staff in the rear of the great chamber, her silver hair catching the light from the holographic displays. At 75, she had survived longer than most who remembered the world before the eagles. Her eyes met Gaius's across the crowd, and in that brief glance passed 27 years of shared understanding, quiet rebellion, and careful hope. "Citizens of the Empire," Gaius began, his voice amplified not just by technology, but by the genetic modifications that made it naturally commanding. "My father built this realm through strength, vision, and unwavering dedication to order. Under his rule, humanity achieved unprecedented unity, technological advancement, and material prosperity." The words were expected, traditional. The Senate relaxed slightly, preparing for the standard recitation of imperial achievements and promises of continuity. But Gaius's next words shattered their complacency. "Yet strength without compassion is mere brutality. Order without justice is simple oppression. Unity achieved through fear is not unity at all. It is merely synchronized submission." His voice carried clearly to every corner of the chamber and through the quantum networks to every province of the empire. "Today begins a new chapter in our shared history." Senator Marcus Brutus, a descendant of the ancient family who had taken the name as a gesture of loyalty during the conquest half, rose from his seat before catching himself. The implications of the emperor's words were staggering. To criticize the previous reign, even indirectly, had been unthinkable. To suggest that the empire's methods required improvement bordered on sedition. "I hereby proclaim the Edict of Rights," Gaius continued, producing a document that bore the imperial seal but had been crafted in secret during the weeks following his father's death. "Every citizen of the empire, regardless of classification, shall possess certain fundamental protections." Dr. Sarah Chen, watching from her assigned position among the scientific advisors, felt her heart racing as she listened to the proclamation. The neural implant that monitored her emotional state would certainly flag the spike in her stress levels, but for the first time in decades, she didn't care about the consequences. "First," Gaius read, his voice growing stronger with each word, "no citizen shall be imprisoned without trial before a magistrate. The practice of predictive arrest is hereby suspended pending judicial review." Gasps echoed through the chamber. The predictive arrest system had been the cornerstone of imperial security, allowing the state to eliminate threats before they materialized. To abandon it seemed like deliberate weakness. "Second, citizens shall possess the right to travel freely between provinces, subject only to reasonable security measures. The internal passport system is dissolved." Provincial Governor Lucius Severus of Germania Province felt his carefully constructed control network crumbling with each word. How could he maintain order if his subjects could simply leave whenever they disagreed with his policies? Third, no citizen's property may be seized without legal justification and fair compensation. The arbitrary reallocation system is replaced with due process requirements. The economic implications were staggering. The empire's ability to reshape society through instant resource redistribution had been one of its most powerful tools. Citizens were beginning to murmur among themselves, some in excitement, others in confusion. Fourth, citizens shall have the right to petition the imperial government for redress of grievances. Offices for this purpose will be established in every provincial capital. This was perhaps the most revolutionary change of all. For 3 decades, citizens had been encouraged to report problems to their local administrators, but questioning government decisions had been classified as seditious behavior. Now, dissent was being institutionalized. Helena's eyes filled with tears she dared not shed publicly. She recognized her own worth. In many of the edict's provisions concepts she had shared with young Gaius during their careful conversations about justice and human dignity. The seeds planted in secret conversations were blooming into imperial policy. But Gaius was not finished. "These rights come with responsibilities," he continued, his voice taking on the iron that had characterized his father's pronouncements. "The Empire's strength has protected humanity from the chaos that once plagued our world. These freedoms are granted to citizens who understand that liberty without order is anarchy." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembly. When he spoke again, his words carried both promise and warning. "Those who would use these new rights to undermine the Empire's stability will discover that mercy has limits. I offer you freedom within strength, choice within unity. Do not mistake compassion for weakness." The executions began that very afternoon. Governor Quintus Maximus of Hispania province had built his reputation on the creative torture of dissidents. His methods had been effective but excessive, earning him both fear and results. Under the previous emperor, results had been sufficient justification. Under the new order, they became evidence of unnecessary cruelty. General Titus Corvus, commander of the Praetorian Guard's special interrogation units, had pioneered techniques that broke the human spirit while leaving the body intact. His victims had provided intelligence, but at costs that Gaius deemed unacceptable. The general's enhanced physiology made him nearly immortal. Nearly. Senator Claudia Maxima had enriched herself through a network of corruption that diverted resources meant for provincial infrastructure into her private accounts. Her crimes had been overlooked because her loyalty to the previous emperor had been absolute. Loyalty bought with theft, Gaius declared, was not loyalty at all. The executions were public, broadcast throughout the empire with the same technological reach that had announced the Edict of Rights. But where his father's executions had been designed to inspire terror, these were presented as justice. Each condemned official was given the opportunity to speak, to explain their actions, to show remorse. Those who demonstrated genuine regret were granted quick deaths. Those who remained defiant discovered that the new emperor's mercy did not extend to the unrepentant. The message was clear. The empire's power remained absolute, but it would now be wielded according to different principles. Efficiency achieved through cruelty was no longer acceptable. Loyalty maintained through fear would be replaced by allegiance earned through justice. In the weeks that followed, the changes rippled through every level of imperial society. Citizens who had lived in carefully contained desperation began to speak more openly, though still cautiously. The surveillance networks remained active, but the algorithms that processed their data had been reprogrammed to distinguish between legitimate dissent and actual sedition. Dr. Chen found herself assigned to a new project, developing technologies that would enhance human dignity rather than merely human control. The irony was not lost on her that she was now working to create surveillance systems designed to protect privacy rather than eliminate it. The provincial governors who survived the initial purge quickly adapted their methods. Public executions for minor infractions ceased. Arbitrary property seizures ended. The classification system remained in place, but advancement between classes became possible through merit rather than bloodline alone. Most significantly, the AI systems that had enforced perfect compliance were reprogrammed to allow for controlled disagreement. Citizens could now voice complaints about local conditions, suggest improvements to imperial policies, even criticize specific officials as long as they maintained overall loyalty to the empire and its emperor. Helena, watching from her quarters in the palace, saw in these changes the fulfillment of conversations that had begun decades earlier. The boy who had asked about schools where children could choose what to learn had become a man who was creating a society where citizens could choose how to serve. It was not the democracy she remembered, but it was a step towards something she had never dared hope for, an empire that served its people rather than simply ruling them. But she also recognized the precarious nature of these reforms. They depended entirely on the character of one man, a man she had helped shape, but who now held power that could corrupt even the most noble intentions. The empire's technological might remained unchanged. Its capacity for control was undiminished. The question that would define the future was whether Gaius would maintain his commitment to justice when that justice proved inconvenient to imperial interests. As the first month of the new reign drew to a close, citizens across the empire began to display something that had been carefully suppressed for decades: hope. But it was hope tempered by the knowledge that their freedoms were gifts from above, not rights claimed from below. The new Caesar had proven he could be both merciful and merciless, but the ultimate test would come when mercy and imperial necessity came into conflict. The eagles still soared over every city. Their holographic wings still cast shadows that spelled out SPQR. But now, for the first time since the conquest, some citizens looked up at those symbols and felt pride rather than fear. The empire endured, but it was beginning to transform from within, shaped by the conscience of a ruler who remembered what it meant to be human. Chapter 6. The Congressional Experiment. 2 years into his reign, Emperor Gaius Justinian Aurelius stood before the greatest architectural achievement of his rule, the Curia Nova, a massive domed structure that rose from the Forum Romanum like a crystalline mountain. The building's transparent walls were composed of programmable matter that could shift from complete opacity to perfect clarity at the emperor's command, symbolizing his intention to make governance visible to the people. Today, those walls were crystal clear, allowing every citizen in the plaza below to witness the birth of something the empire had never seen: elected representation. The creation of the Senatus Populusque, the Congress of Senate and people represented a careful balance between democratic participation and imperial control. Of the 300 seats in the Great Chamber, 200 will be filled through popular elections in the provinces. But 100 seats, precisely 1/3, will be reserved for imperial appointees selected personally by the emperor from candidates recommended by his senior advisors. This proportion had been calculated with mathematical precision, large enough to ensure that no legislation could pass without imperial approval, yet small enough that the elected representatives could still accomplish meaningful work for their constituents. The imperial appointees were not mere rubber stamps for the emperor's will. They were selected for expertise in areas where popular opinion might lack technical knowledge: military affairs, economic policy, scientific research, and diplomatic relations. Many were former provincial governors who had demonstrated both competence and ethical behavior under the new standards. Others were scholars, engineers, and administrators whose skills complemented the passion and local knowledge of the elected representatives. The creation of the Senatus Populusque had required 2 years of careful preparation. Constitutional scholars who had been imprisoned under his father's rule were quietly released and given new identities as historical research consultants. Their task was to study the governmental systems that had existed before the conquest, not to restore them, but to adapt their best features to imperial reality. Dr. Marcus Chen Sara's younger brother, who had survived the purges by accepting classification as a citizen engineer, had led the technical team responsible for creating the electoral systems. The challenge had been immense: how to allow genuine choice while ensuring loyalty, how to encourage debate while preventing sedition, how to give citizens a voice while maintaining imperial unity. The solution they developed was elegant in its complexity. Every potential candidate for the elected positions had to pass through a three-stage process that the emperor had personally designed. First came the examination of competence, a comprehensive test of knowledge covering everything from basic economics to military strategy. No citizen could represent others without demonstrating fundamental understanding of governance. Second was the trial of character, a period of community service during which candidates worked directly with the people they sought to represent. They served in hospitals, taught in schools, worked in factories, and lived in the housing provided to citizens of all classifications. Those who emerged from this trial with genuine empathy for their constituents advanced to the final stage. The third and most crucial test was the oath of loyalty, but not the mindless recitation that had characterized imperial service under the previous emperor. Candidates were required to articulate their vision for improving imperial society while explicitly acknowledging the emperor's ultimate authority. They had to demonstrate that they understood the difference between constructive criticism and destructive rebellion. Helena, now 80 years old and officially designated as the emperor's historical advisor, had helped craft the language of that oath. Her words, refined through decades of careful navigation between truth and survival, had become the foundation for legitimate political discourse within the empire. "I swear by all the gods and by the honor of Rome," the oath began, "to serve the people of the empire with wisdom, courage, and integrity. I acknowledge that the emperor holds ultimate authority over all matters of state, but I pledge to represent honestly the needs and aspirations of my constituents. I will speak truth to power when truth serves the empire's interests, and I will support the emperor's decisions even when I disagree with them. I understand that loyalty does not require silence, but that responsibility requires respect for the greater good." The first elections had been a spectacle unlike anything the empire had ever witnessed. Campaign rallies were held in public squares where citizens could question candidates directly. For the first time in 3 decades, people gathered to debate political ideas rather than simply receive instructions. The surveillance networks monitored every word, but the algorithms had been reprogrammed to distinguish between passionate advocacy and seditious incitement. Marcus Flavius, a former factory supervisor from Germania province, had won his seat by promising to address the working conditions in the manufacturing sectors. His campaign speeches drew crowds of thousands. Citizens who had never before been asked for their opinions about anything beyond their assigned duties. His victory speech had been broadcast throughout the empire as an example of how democracy could function within imperial structure. "My fellow citizens," he had declared, standing on a platform erected in the same square where resistance fighters had been executed just 5 years earlier, "we have been given a gift of trust by our emperor. He has shown faith in our judgment, in our ability to choose leaders who will serve both our needs and the empire's greatness. I pledge to prove worthy of that trust." But it was Julia Maxima's victory in Britannia province that had truly tested the system's boundaries. A former teacher who had lost her position during the educational reforms of the previous reign, she had campaigned on the radical platform of expanding educational opportunities for citizens of all classifications. Her speeches contained barely concealed criticism of imperial policies, yet she had been careful to frame every critique as a suggestion for improvement rather than fundamental opposition. "The empire's strength lies in the talents of its people," she had argued during her final campaign rally. "Every citizen prevented from reaching their full potential is a loss to our collective greatness." I do not question the wisdom of our classification system, but I believe that system can be enhanced to better serve both individual aspirations and imperial needs. Her victory had sent shockwaves through the traditional power structure. Provincial governors who had grown comfortable with unchallenged authority suddenly found themselves dealing with elected representatives who commanded genuine popular support. The balance of power was shifting, even if ultimate authority remained with the emperor. The Congress itself met in sessions that were broadcast live throughout the empire. Citizens could watch their representatives debate infrastructure projects, educational policies, and resource allocation. The format had been carefully designed to encourage substantive discussion while preventing chaos. Each representative could speak for a maximum of 10 minutes on any topic, and all speeches had to be submitted in advance for security review. But the review process focused on preventing incitement to violence rather than suppressing disagreement. The emperor attended the opening session personally, taking his place on a throne that rose from the chamber floor on a hydraulic platform. The symbolism was deliberate. He was elevated above the proceedings but remained visible and present. When he chose to participate in debates, his platform would lower to floor level, creating the visual impression that he was temporarily stepping down to their level rather than forcing them to rise to his. Honored representatives, Gaius had addressed the First Congress, his enhanced voice carrying easily through the chamber without technological amplification. You are here because the people have chosen you to speak for them. I am here because the gods and history have chosen me to rule over all. These are not contradictory roles, they are complementary ones. You will give voice to the needs of citizens. I will ensure that those needs are met within the context of imperial strength and unity. The first major debate had concerned the construction of a new transportation network connecting the outer provinces. Representative Flavius had argued passionately for high-speed rail lines that would allow citizens to travel freely for both economic and personal reasons. Representative Chen from Sina Province had countered with a proposal for atmospheric transport systems that would be more efficient but required greater imperial oversight. The debate had continued for 3 days, with representatives presenting economic analyses, environmental impact studies, and citizen surveys. It was democracy in action, constrained democracy, but democracy nonetheless. The emperor had listened to every argument before announcing his decision. A hybrid system that incorporated elements from both proposals while adding security features that neither had considered. More importantly, he had explained his reasoning in detail, showing how citizen input had influenced imperial policy. Representative Flavius has convinced me that freedom of movement is essential to citizen happiness, he had declared. Representative Chen has shown me that efficiency serves the greater good. Together, you have helped me understand that the best solutions often combine apparent opposites. But the Congress's most significant achievement had been the creation of the Citizen Advocacy Office in every provincial capital. These institutions, proposed by Representative Maxima and refined through months of debate, gave ordinary citizens a direct channel to report grievances, suggest improvements, and petition for redress of wrongs. The offices were staffed by both appointed officials and elected representatives, ensuring that citizen concerns would receive attention from both imperial administrators and popular advocates. The system was not without its critics. Senator Lucius Crassus, one of the appointed representatives who had served under the previous emperor, had argued that giving citizens too much voice would lead to unrealistic expectations and eventual disappointment. The masses, he had warned during a closed session, do not understand the complexities of governance. They will demand immediate solutions to problems that require long-term planning. The emperor's response had been characteristically nuanced. Senator Crassus speaks from experience, he had acknowledged. The people do sometimes want simple answers to complex questions, but that does not mean their concerns are invalid. It means we must educate them about the realities of governance while addressing their legitimate needs. This philosophy had led to the creation of citizen education programs, voluntary courses offered in every community that explained how imperial government functioned, why certain policies were necessary, and how citizens could most effectively participate in the democratic elements of the system. The courses were taught by a combination of imperial administrators and elected representatives, ensuring that citizens received both official perspectives and popular viewpoints. The success of these programs had exceeded all expectations. Citizens who understood how the empire functioned were more likely to support imperial policies, even when those policies required personal sacrifice. They were also more effective at identifying genuine problems and proposing workable solutions. Democracy, it turned out, worked better when Democrats understood the system they were participating in. Dr. Sarah Chen, now serving as a technical advisor to the Congress, had been amazed by the transformation in her own thinking. For decades, she had viewed the empire as an oppressive force that crushed human dignity beneath the weight of technological control. Now, she found herself working to improve that system from within, helping to design the very algorithms that made democratic participation possible under imperial rule. The irony was not lost on her that she was creating surveillance systems designed to protect rather than oppress. The new monitoring networks could detect when citizens were being denied their rights by local officials, when elected representatives were failing to serve their constituents effectively, and when popular sentiment was shifting in ways that required imperial attention. Technology that had once been used to eliminate dissent was now being used to identify and address legitimate grievances before they became sources of instability. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the emperor himself. The young man who had once questioned the morality of absolute power now wielded that power with a confidence that came from knowing it was being used justly. He had learned to listen without surrendering authority, to compromise without abandoning principles, to reform without destroying. Helena, watching from her private box during congressional sessions, saw in these proceedings the fulfillment of dreams she had never dared speak aloud. The boy who had asked about schools where children could choose what to learn had created a government where citizens could choose how to serve. It was not the democracy she remembered from her youth, but it was something perhaps more stable. Democracy constrained by wisdom, freedom balanced by responsibility, popular will guided by imperial vision. As the second year of congressional operations drew to a close, citizens throughout the empire were beginning to display something that had been absent since the conquest: civic pride. They took ownership of the policies their representatives had helped create. They participated in community discussions about imperial priorities. They felt, for the first time in decades, that their voices mattered in the grand sweep of history. The eagles still soared over every city. Their holographic wings still cast shadows that spelled out SPQR. But now those shadows fell upon citizens who saw themselves as participants in imperial greatness, rather than merely subjects of imperial power. The empire had learned to govern through consent as well as control, and both rulers and ruled were discovering that this approach might be stronger than either had imagined. Chapter 7. Balancing Justice and Power. 5 years into the reign of Emperor Gaius Justinian Aurelius, the empire had learned to walk the razor's edge between justice and necessity, between mercy and strength. The balance was maintained not through abstract principles, but through the emperor's personal involvement in cases that tested the boundaries of his reforms. Each decision became a precedent, each judgment a lesson in how power could serve both the individual and the collective good. The case that would define his reputation came from an unexpected source: General Marcus Brutus Severus, commander of the 10th Legion stationed in Germania province. Severus was a product of the old system, genetically enhanced, absolutely loyal, and utterly ruthless in his methods. Under the previous emperor, his effectiveness had made him untouchable. Under the new order, his methods had made him a problem. The charges against Severus were brought by Representative Julia Maxima, acting on behalf of citizens in the industrial city of Neo-Cologne. The general had been systematically extracting tribute from local businesses to fund unauthorized military exercises. When a factory owner named Klaus Weber had refused to pay, Severus had ordered his troops to confiscate Weber's property and exile his family to the outer provinces. Under the old system, this would have been viewed as maintaining discipline. Under the Edict of Rights, it was theft and abuse of power. The trial was held in the Curia Nova, with the full Congress serving as jury and the emperor presiding as judge. The transparent walls remained clear throughout the proceedings, allowing citizens across the empire to witness justice in action. The symbolism was deliberate. Power exercised in darkness bred corruption, but power exercised in light served truth. Severus entered the chamber wearing his full military regalia. His enhanced physique, making him appear larger than life among the civilian representatives. His defense was simple and direct. Everything he had done served the empire's interests. The tribute-funded training that kept the legions sharp. The punishment of Weber sent a message that imperial authority could not be challenged. In the old days, such arguments would have been sufficient. "Honored Emperor," Severus declared, his genetically modified voice carrying easily through the vast chamber. "I have served Rome for 30 years. I have conquered provinces, crushed rebellions, and maintained order in the most difficult territories. If my methods seem harsh, it is because the alternatives are chaos and weakness." The emperor listened without expression, his enhanced features betraying no hint of his thoughts. But Helena, watching from her advisor's gallery, recognized the subtle signs of internal struggle that she had learned to read over decades of observation. This was the moment that would define whether his reforms were genuine transformation or merely cosmetic changes. Representative Maxima presented her case with the passion of someone who had lived under both systems and understood the difference. She called witnesses, not just Weber, but dozens of citizens who had suffered under Severus's interpretation of imperial authority. Their testimonies painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as efficient governance. A shopkeeper named Maria Fischer, Maxima testified, was forced to provide free supplies to the legion because the general decided her profits were excessive. When she protested, her shop was declared a security risk and closed. Her crime was not disloyalty, it was success without permission. The imperial appointees in Congress found themselves in an impossible position. Many had served under similar circumstances, making hard choices to maintain order in difficult situations. Senator Lucius Crassus, the emperor's chief political advisor, argued quietly but forcefully that punishing effective commanders would weaken military discipline throughout the empire. "Your Majesty," Crassus said during a private consultation, "Severus may have exceeded his authority, but his methods achieved results. If we punish every general who used harsh measures, we risk paralyzing our military leadership. Sometimes justice must yield to necessity." But Dr. Sarah Chen, now serving as the emperor's technical advisor on citizen welfare, had compiled data that told a different story. Her analysis showed that provinces governed through fear consistently underperformed economically, socially, and even militarily when compared to regions ruled through consent and cooperation. "The evidence is clear, Your Majesty," she reported during the same consultation. "Territories that respect citizen rights show higher productivity, greater innovation, and stronger loyalty to imperial ideals. Fear may achieve short-term compliance, but trust builds long-term strength." The emperor's decision, when it came, demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of power he had developed since taking the throne. He found Severus guilty of abuse of authority, but acknowledged that the general had acted according to the standards of his time. The sentence reflected this nuanced judgment. "General Severus," the emperor declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the empire through the quantum communication networks. "You have served Rome with dedication, but dedication without wisdom becomes mere brutality. You will be stripped of command and reduced to the rank of centurion. However, you will not be executed or exiled. Instead, you will serve for 2 years in the Citizen Advocacy Office of Neo-Cologne, where you will process the very complaints that your methods created." The sentence shocked everyone in the chamber. It was both merciful and merciless. Severus would live, but he would spend years confronting the human cost of his actions. More importantly, the emperor had sent a clear message to the military hierarchy. Effectiveness would no longer excuse cruelty, but service to the empire would always be valued over personal punishment. The aftermath of the Severus trial rippled through every level of imperial society. Military commanders began reviewing their methods, seeking ways to maintain discipline while respecting citizen rights. Provincial governors instituted regular hearings where citizens could voice complaints without fear of retaliation. The imperial bureaucracy, which had operated on fear and rigid hierarchy, began to adapt to a system that valued both efficiency and humanity. But the emperor's commitment to balancing justice with imperial necessity was tested from another direction. When the province of Aegyptus experienced what could only be called open rebellion. The uprising began in the city of New Alexandria, where citizens had catastrophically misinterpreted the expanded rights as license for complete autonomy. Led by a charismatic former professor named Dmitri Constantine, the rebels had declared their independence from imperial rule, seized government buildings, and established what they called a free democratic republic. The emperor's response was swift, decisive, and lethally precise. Rather than deploying conventional forces that might harm innocent civilians, he authorized the use of the empire's most advanced targeted elimination systems. Orbital platforms deployed quantum-guided plasma bolts that could track individual DNA signatures from space. Atmospheric drones released microscopic hunter-killers programmed to seek only those citizens who had actively participated in the rebellion. Within 3 hours, every rebel leader and armed insurgent was dead. Constantine himself was vaporized by a precision plasma strike while giving a speech from the steps of the seized government building. His followers died where they stood, their bodies turning to ash so quickly that nearby civilians weren't even aware of what had happened until the operation was complete. The precision was breathtaking in its technological sophistication. Families eating dinner were unharmed while rebels sitting at the same table were eliminated. Children playing in parks continued their games while armed insurgents standing mere meters away simply ceased to exist. The city's infrastructure remained intact. Not a single innocent civilian suffered so much as a scratch. "Citizens of New Alexandria," the emperor's voice resonated through speakers that had been rapidly deployed after the elimination operation. "You have witnessed the precision of imperial justice. Those who sought to destroy the order that protects you have been removed from existence. Those who remained loyal to the empire have been protected absolutely." The aftermath of the New Alexandria elimination was profound in its psychological impact. Citizens throughout the empire understood that rebellion was not merely futile, it was impossible to survive. But they also saw that the empire's technological precision protected the innocent with the same ruthless efficiency that it eliminated the guilty. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty meant safety, rebellion meant death, and the empire could distinguish between the two with perfect accuracy. Provincial governors reported complete elimination of separatist sentiment following the New Alexandria incident. Citizens channeled their desires for greater participation into the legitimate structures the emperor had created: the Congress, the citizen advocacy offices, and the various democratic reforms that allowed voice without rebellion. The very idea of armed resistance became not just unthinkable, but literally impossible given the empire's technological capabilities. Dr. Chen, analyzing the data from the elimination's aftermath, was struck by the clinical perfection of the Emperor's approach. "Your Majesty," she reported during one of their regular consultations, "the precision of our response has eliminated resistance movements throughout the Empire. Citizens now understand that the choice is simple: participate within the system or cease to exist." The technological capabilities demonstrated during the rebellion had other effects as well. Scientists throughout the Empire began developing more advanced precision weapons, understanding that the Emperor preferred solutions that eliminated threats while preserving loyal citizens. Military commanders adapted their tactics to emphasize surgical elimination over area destruction. The Empire's technological superiority became a tool for perfect discrimination between friend and enemy. Most importantly, the rebellion's complete elimination allowed the Emperor to focus entirely on positive reforms. Citizens saw that challenges to imperial authority would be met with instant annihilation, but they also saw that loyalty and constructive participation would be rewarded with expanded rights and opportunities within the imperial framework. Helena, now 82 and growing frail despite the life-extending medical treatments available to imperial advisors, watched these developments with complex emotions. The boy who had asked about the value of choice had become a man who protected the right to choose while eliminating those who chose wrongly. It was not the democracy she had known in her youth, but it was a system that combined perfect order with measured justice. "You have learned to be both protector and executioner," she told him during one of their private conversations. "Your father ruled through widespread fear. You rule through precise fear, and perhaps that discrimination makes all the difference." The Emperor nodded, understanding that his surgical approach to rebellion was more effective than his father's broader brutality. "The Empire must demonstrate that rebellion is impossible," he replied, "but it must also show that loyalty is rewarded. Those who work within the system find mercy and opportunity. Those who seek to destroy it find only perfect elimination." The technological precision of the new Alexandria operation became a model for imperial responses throughout the territories. Dissent within legitimate channels was not only permitted, but encouraged. Rebellion outside those channels resulted in instant, precise deaths. Citizens learned to distinguish between acceptable criticism and unacceptable insurrection, understanding that the Empire's censors could detect the difference with lethal accuracy. Regional cultural celebrations began incorporating themes of imperial protection alongside traditional elements. Artists created works that praised both local heritage and the imperial technology that preserved it. Scientists competed not just for personal advancement, but for the honor of contributing to the precision systems that protected loyal citizens while eliminating threats. The surveillance networks that had once monitored for dissent now primarily tracked satisfaction and engagement, while simultaneously maintaining perfect records of every citizen's loyalty status. Citizens were more likely to report problems through official channels than to even consider resistance, knowing that the Empire's response systems could distinguish between helpful criticism and dangerous rebellion with perfect accuracy. As his 5th year of rule drew to a close, citizens throughout the Empire had learned to live within the boundaries he had established with complete understanding of the consequences. They participated enthusiastically in the democratic elements of the system while knowing that those elements existed within an imperial framework, protected by technology that made rebellion literally impossible for any individual to survive. The eagles still soared over every city, but now they soared over citizens who understood that those eagles represented not just imperial power, but imperial precision, the ability to protect the innocent and eliminate the guilty with perfect discrimination. The Empire had learned to balance justice and power through technological supremacy that made both mercy and elimination instruments of surgical precision. It was a balance that offered unlimited opportunity to those who accepted imperial authority and instant death to those who did not. a system more stable than either pure autocracy or unlimited democracy had ever achieved, protected by technology that made the choice between loyalty and annihilation perfectly clear to every citizen in the empire. Chapter 8. Whispered Dreams. 10 years into the reign of Emperor Gaius Justinian Aurelius, the empire had achieved something unprecedented in human history: a population that genuinely loved their government. In taverns and homes across every province, citizens no longer whispered complaints about imperial rule. They boasted about it. The transformation was so complete that visitors from the outer territories, where imperial control remained more traditional, were struck by the visible pride radiating from citizens who had learned to see their rights not as concessions but as proof of imperial greatness. Dr. Sarah Chen walked through the evening markets of Geneva, marveling at sights that would have been unimaginable under the previous emperor. Citizens moved freely between districts without internal passports, their conversations animated and unguarded. Street performers entertained crowds with satirical songs that gently mocked local administrators, the kind of humor that would have resulted in instant arrest a decade earlier. Children played games that celebrated both their regional heritage and imperial achievements, wearing miniature togas alongside traditional Swiss lederhosen in combinations that somehow seemed natural rather than forced. The pride was most visible in the small details that citizens had begun incorporating into their daily lives. Workers arriving at their assigned positions wore imperial eagles alongside personal ornaments, displaying their classification badges not with resignation, but with the satisfaction of people who knew their place in a system that valued their contributions. Students in the renovated schools competed fiercely for advancement opportunities, understanding that merit could now overcome the barriers of birth classification that had seemed insurmountable under the old order. Maria Santos, a former factory worker who had risen to become an elected representative from Columbia Province, exemplified this transformation. She sat in her constituent office in New York, now Novum Iberacum, listening to citizens who came not with desperate pleas for survival, but with suggestions for improving their already comfortable lives. The conversation she was having with a local shopkeeper would have been impossible a decade earlier. "Representative Santos," said Marcus Webb, a second-generation imperial citizen whose grandfather had been executed for resistance during the conquest, "I want to thank the Emperor for the new commercial guidelines. My business has tripled since we gained the right to set our own prices within the approved ranges. But I've been thinking, what if we could propose a pilot program for extended trading hours during the winter months? It would boost economic activity and give citizens more flexibility in their shopping schedules." The request was remarkable not for its content, but for its tone. Webb spoke as someone who expected to be heard, who believed his ideas had value, who saw himself as a participant in imperial greatness rather than merely a subject of imperial authority. Santos nodded thoughtfully, making notes that she would include in her next report to the provincial governor and her speech to the Imperial Congress. "That's an excellent suggestion, Marcus," she replied, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who knew such ideas would receive serious consideration. "I'll propose it to the Economic Development Committee next week. The Emperor has consistently shown that good ideas from citizens strengthen the empire, regardless of where they originate." This conversation, multiplied across millions of similar interactions throughout the empire, represented a revolution in the relationship between rulers and ruled. Citizens had learned to think of themselves as participants in imperial success rather than victims of imperial control. They took ownership of policies their representatives had helped create and felt genuine satisfaction when those policies improved their lives. The cultural renaissance that had emerged from this new relationship was extraordinary in its scope and authenticity. Artists no longer created propaganda disguised as art. They created genuine expressions of imperial pride that resonated with citizens who shared those feelings. The great amphitheaters that had once hosted gladiatorial combats now featured performances that celebrated both classical Roman achievements and contemporary imperial innovations. Citizens attended these events not because they were required to, but because they genuinely enjoyed celebrating the civilization they had helped build. In the rebuilt Library of Alexandria. Now, the greatest center of learning in human history, scholars from every province contributed to research projects that advanced both knowledge and imperial power. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a descendant of Helena who had inherited both her ancestors' intelligence and her love of learning, led a team developing new educational technologies that would allow citizens to pursue advanced studies regardless of their original classification. "The Emperor has given us something remarkable," she explained to her research team, which included citizens from every level of the imperial hierarchy. "He has shown us that an empire can be strong without being cruel, that order can coexist with opportunity. Our work here doesn't just serve imperial interests, it serves our own interests because we are the empire." The pride citizens felt in their system was perhaps most evident in their casual conversations about imperial achievements. Citizens spoke of the empire's technological marvels and social innovations as personal accomplishments, displaying a sense of ownership that would have been impossible under the previous emperor's regime. "You have to understand," explained Thomas Anderson, a citizen engineer working on the atmospheric processing stations that had eliminated climate change throughout the empire. "This isn't just the government that rules us, it's the civilization we've built together. Yes, the emperor has ultimate authority, but he uses that authority to protect and advance everything we've created. When I see those orbital platforms that stopped the rebels in New Alexandria, I don't think about imperial oppression. I think about how amazing it is that we've developed technology that can protect innocent people with such precision." The economic prosperity that accompanied these cultural changes was unprecedented. Citizens who felt invested in the system worked not just to fulfill their assigned duties, but to exceed them. Innovation flourished as people competed not just for personal advancement, but for the honor of contributing to imperial greatness. The result was technological and social progress that benefited everyone within the system. Provincial festivals had evolved to celebrate both local traditions and imperial achievements. The autumn harvest celebration in Germania province featured traditional folk dances alongside displays of the agricultural technologies that had eliminated famine throughout the region. Citizens wore flower crowns that incorporated both native plants and genetically modified specimens that had been developed in imperial laboratories to symbolize the beauty that emerged when tradition embraced progress. But perhaps the most striking evidence of citizen satisfaction was found in their private conversations, the discussions that took place in homes and gathering places where people felt free to speak their minds. Dr. Chen, whose neural implant now served primarily to monitor her health rather than her political reliability, regularly attended social gatherings where she heard citizens debating not whether the empire was good, but how it could become even better. "I heard Representative Maxima's proposal for extending voting rights to 16-year-olds, said Anna Kowalski, a citizen teacher from Polonia province, during a dinner party that included citizens from multiple classifications. "I think it's brilliant. Young people who grow up under the current system understand imperial citizenship better than adults who still remember the chaos of the old world." Her dinner companions nodded thoughtfully, their discussion continuing for hours as they explored the implications of various political reforms. But what was most remarkable about their conversation was its underlying assumption. They were discussing improvements to a system they valued, not escape from one they despised. The careful balance between freedom and loyalty that the emperor had established meant that even the most ambitious discussions of reform were framed in terms of strengthening imperial unity rather than challenging imperial authority. Citizens had learned to dream big within the boundaries he had established, and those boundaries had proven spacious enough to accommodate remarkable aspirations. In the taverns of Londinium, citizens raised toasts not just to the emperor's health, but to the achievements of their fellow citizens. They celebrated the promotion of a neighbor to a higher classification, the success of a local business, the opening of a new school or hospital. The empire had become something they took personal pride in because they felt genuinely included in its success. Young Representative James Aurelius, no relation to the imperial family, despite sharing the name exemplified this new generation of imperial citizens. Born after the conquest, he had grown up under the reformed system and saw no contradiction between democratic participation and imperial loyalty. During debates in the Imperial Congress, he spoke with the passion of someone who believed deeply in both citizen rights and imperial greatness. "Honored colleagues," he had declared during a recent session, "we have been given the greatest gift in human history, the opportunity to serve a civilization that serves us in return. When citizens look at us, they don't see oppressed subjects. They see people who have achieved something unprecedented. We are Romans not because we were conquered, but because we chose to become the best version of ourselves within the greatest system ever devised." His words were met with enthusiastic applause from both elected and appointed representatives, a response that would have been impossible under the previous emperor's regime where applause was mandated rather than genuine. The transformation was even visible in the surveillance networks that monitored citizen activity. Where once these systems had focused on detecting dissent and rebellion, they now primarily tracked satisfaction and engagement. The algorithms that processed citizen communications were programmed to identify opportunities for improving services rather than threats to imperial authority. Citizens knew they were being monitored, but they also knew that monitoring was designed to serve their interests rather than suppress them. Helena, now 85 and confined to a hover chair, but still serving as the emperor's most trusted advisor, watched these developments with profound satisfaction. The boy who had questioned the nature of power had become a man who had taught an empire to love itself. But she also recognized the delicate nature of what had been achieved and the careful way citizens expressed their dreams for the future. In her private conversations with citizens throughout the empire, she heard dreams that would have been seditious under the previous regime, but were now simply hopeful aspirations. People spoke quietly about the possibility that future emperors might grant even greater freedoms, might expand democratic participation, might eventually create a system where most power resided with the people rather than the throne. But even these whispered dreams were always accompanied by careful affirmations of loyalty to the current system. "Of course, whatever His Majesty decides will be wisdom," citizens would quickly add, after expressing their hopes for constitutional monarchy. "We would accept any system he chooses because he has proven his commitment to our welfare." These are just thoughts about possibilities, not criticisms of what we have. The fear of sedition charges remained real and present, a reminder that the empire's tolerance for discussion had limits. Citizens had learned to navigate these boundaries with remarkable skill, expressing their hopes in language that emphasized loyalty while suggesting evolution rather than revolution. They dreamed of progress within the system rather than replacement of the system, understanding that the emperor's benevolence depended on their continued demonstration of trustworthiness. As the 10th year of Gaius's reign drew to a close, surveys conducted by the imperial administration revealed satisfaction rates that exceeded 90% across all provinces and classifications. Citizens reported feeling safer, more prosperous, and more fulfilled than they had at any point since the conquest. More remarkably, they reported feeling proud to be Romans, not merely resigned to imperial rule, but genuinely enthusiastic about their place in what they saw as history's greatest civilization. The eagles that soared over imperial cities no longer represented conquest and control. They represented achievement and belonging. Citizens looked up at those holographic symbols and saw not reminders of their subjugation, but celebrations of their participation in something magnificent. The empire had learned to inspire rather than merely compel, and its citizens had responded by becoming not just subjects, but true believers in the imperial dream. Dr. Chen, reflecting on the transformation she had witnessed and participated in, marveled at how completely the relationship between citizen and state had been reimagined. "We've become proud to be Roman," she wrote in her private journal, "not because we've forgotten what we lost, but because we've gained something we never expected. A government that actually serves our interests while asking for our loyalty in return. The emperor has achieved what every ruler in history has attempted. He has made tyranny feel like freedom by making freedom real within the boundaries of necessary order." The whispered dreams of constitutional monarchy remained just that, whispers and dreams. But they were spoken by citizens who felt heard, valued, and protected by the system they hoped to see evolve. It was perhaps the greatest achievement of the emperor's reign. He had created a population that loved their government enough to dream of making it even better, rather than simply fantasizing about its destruction. Chapter 9. The Emperor's Reflection. 15 years into his reign, Emperor Gaius Justinian Aurelius stood in the memorial garden of Helena Vasquez, a quiet sanctuary he had commissioned within the Palatine complex after her death 3 years earlier. The garden was designed around principles she had taught him: that beauty should serve contemplation, that power should pause for wisdom, and that even emperors needed spaces where they could remember their humanity. The memorial itself was elegant in its simplicity. A white marble bench facing a fountain, whose waters carried microscopic processors that created shifting patterns of light, each one representing a life she had touched through her influence on his policies. Around the garden grew plants from every province of the empire: roses from Gallia, cherry trees from Nippon, olive groves from Hispania, a living testament to the unity that had emerged from conquest. It was here, in the pre-dawn hours when the rest of the palace slept, that Gaius came to wrestle with the weight of absolute power and the responsibility of shepherding humanity's future. The genetic enhancements that had made him physically superior to ordinary humans could not ease the burden of conscience that came with ruling billions of people. If anything, his enhanced cognitive abilities made him more acutely aware of the moral complexities of every decision. Dr. Sarah Chen, now 78, and serving as his senior advisor on citizen welfare, found him there as she often did, reviewing reports that painted a picture of unprecedented human prosperity. The holographic displays that floated before his throne showed statistics that would have been impossible to achieve under any previous system of government. Literacy rates at 100%, poverty essentially eliminated, violent crime reduced to statistical insignificance, and technological advancement accelerating at rates that suggested humanity was approaching a new phase of evolution. "The quarterly satisfaction surveys, Your Majesty," she said, settling onto a bench that had been positioned at precisely the right distance to allow private conversation without triggering the proximity protocols that would activate recording systems. Even in his moments of reflection, the emperor remained surrounded by the apparatus of power, though he had learned to create pockets of genuine privacy within its embrace. 94% positive across all provinces, she continued, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and wonder that never quite faded despite years of witnessing impossible achievements. Citizens report feeling safer, more prosperous, and more fulfilled than at any point in recorded history. More remarkably, 87% described themselves as proud to be Roman, not merely satisfied with imperial rule, but genuinely enthusiastic about their identity as imperial citizens. Gaius nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful rather than triumphant. These numbers represented the culmination of everything he had worked toward, Yet they also raised questions that kept him awake during the quiet hours, when the weight of the future pressed most heavily upon his shoulders. "And what of the other 6%?" he asked, referring to those citizens whose satisfaction remained qualified or uncertain. "What do they tell us about the sustainability of what we've built?" Chen consulted her secondary displays, calling up demographic analyses that revealed the Empire's few remaining sources of discontent. "Mostly citizens over 70 who still remember the pre-conquest world," she reported. "They appreciate the security and prosperity, but they struggle with what they describe as the loss of authentic choice. Interestingly, their children and grandchildren rarely share these concerns." This generational divide had become one of the Emperor's primary focuses in recent years. Citizens who had lived through the chaos of the old world possessed perspectives that he valued, even when those perspectives challenged the foundations of imperial rule. Their criticisms, carefully expressed within the bounds of acceptable discourse, often identified blind spots that younger citizens, others within the system, might not recognize. Marcus Webb, the shopkeeper who had once proposed extended trading hours to Representative Santos, now served on the Citizen Advisory Council that met monthly with the Emperor himself. At 65, he straddled the generational divide, old enough to remember the conquest, but young enough to appreciate the improvements that had followed. "Your Majesty," he had said during their most recent meeting, "my grandmother lived through the transition from the old world to your father's empire, and then to your own. She tells me that each generation has gained something while losing something. We've gained security and prosperity, but we've lost— I'm not sure how to say this respectfully. We've lost the right to fail completely." The observation had struck Gaius with unexpected force. The Empire had indeed eliminated most forms of failure. Citizens couldn't starve, couldn't be left without medical care, couldn't fall into the desperate poverty that had characterized the old world. But in creating this safety net, had they also eliminated something essential about the human experience? Helena's influence remained strong even 3 years after her death, her teachings preserved not just in his memory, but in the detailed philosophical journals she had maintained throughout their decades together. He often consulted these writings when facing questions that seemed to require more than administrative solutions. "The greatest danger to any empire," she had written in one of her final entries, "is not external threat or internal rebellion, but the gradual loss of the qualities that made it worth preserving. Power corrupts not through evil intention, but through the slow erosion of the leader's connection to the experiences of ordinary people." This warning had shaped his approach to governance in ways both large and small. He maintained regular direct contact with citizens through the Advisory Council, conducted unannounced visits to provincial capitals, and required that all policy proposals include detailed analyses of their impact on individual lives rather than merely statistical outcomes. The garden's fountain shifted its light patterns as the first rays of dawn touched the Palatine complex, and Gaius found himself contemplating the reports that would shape his morning. The provincial governors were requesting approval for the next phase of genetic enhancement programs that would allow ordinary citizens to access some of the physical and cognitive improvements previously reserved for the ruling class. The research data suggested these enhancements in the future could help eliminate most remaining sources of human suffering: disease, aging, the intellectual limitations that prevented some citizens from fully participating in imperial society. Yet something about the proposal troubled him. Each technological advancement that improved human life also seemed to distance humanity from the essential struggles that had once defined the species. Citizens who never faced genuine hardship might never develop the resilience that had allowed previous generations to build great civilizations. People who never encountered authentic choice between meaningful alternatives might never develop the wisdom necessary for self-governance. "Dr. Chen," he said, turning to face his advisor with the expression of someone wrestling with fundamental questions, Do you believe our citizens are happier than their ancestors, or merely more comfortable? The question hung in the morning air like a challenge to everything they had accomplished. Chen, who had lived through both systems and helped design many of the reforms that had transformed imperial society, considered her response carefully. "I think, Your Majesty, that we may have solved problems that were never meant to be solved," she finally replied. Hunger, disease, ignorance, insecurity, these were genuine evils that destroyed countless lives. But perhaps they also served purposes we didn't fully understand. Perhaps the struggle against them was part of what made humans human. The Emperor nodded slowly, recognizing in her words the echo of conversations he had shared with Helena about the relationship between adversity and growth, between security and strength. The Empire had achieved unprecedented success by eliminating most sources of human suffering, but that very success raised questions about whether they had also eliminated essential sources of human development. These philosophical concerns had practical implications for the decisions that awaited him in the throne room. The genetic enhancement proposal represented a logical extension of imperial policy. If technology could make citizens healthier, smarter, and more capable, didn't the Empire have an obligation to provide those improvements? Yet each enhancement also moved humanity further from the species that had built the first civilizations, won the first freedoms, created the first art and literature that had inspired Helena's teaching. The morning briefings would also include updates on the succession question that had begun to occupy more of his attention as his 15th year of rule approached its end. At 46, enhanced by the same technologies that had made his father nearly immortal, Gaius could expect to rule for decades or even centuries more. But the stability of the empire depended on more than his personal longevity. It required institutional structures that could preserve the balance between order and freedom he had achieved. The Imperial Congress had evolved into something unprecedented in human history, a democratic body that operated within autocratic constraints, allowing genuine representation while preserving ultimate authority in the imperial throne. But would this balance survive his death? Could any successor maintain the delicate equilibrium between citizen satisfaction and imperial control that had made the current system possible? Representative Maria Santos, now serving her third term and widely regarded as the most effective advocate for citizen interests in the Congress, had privately suggested that the succession process itself might be democratized. Rather than allowing genetic inheritance to determine the next emperor, why not allow the Congress to select from among several qualified candidates? The idea had merit, but it also carried risks that kept Gaius awake during his pre-dawn contemplations. Any system that depends on the character of a single individual, Helena had written in her journals, is ultimately unstable. True reform must create structures that can survive both good and bad leadership. This observation had led him to spend increasing amounts of time designing constitutional frameworks that could preserve citizen rights and democratic participation even under less benevolent rulers. The challenge was creating limitations on imperial power that would prevent tyranny without crippling the efficiency that had made the empire successful. As the sun rose fully over the Palatine complex, casting long shadows across the memorial garden, Gaius made the decision that would define the remainder of his reign. He would use his remaining years not merely to maintain the system he had created, but to evolve it towards something that could survive his absence. The reforms he had implemented had proven that empire could coexist with democracy, that order could embrace freedom. Now he would discover whether those achievements could be institutionalized in ways that transcended individual leadership. The morning's first appointment would be with the Constitutional Commission he had secretly established 6 months earlier, a body of scholars, citizens, and officials tasked with designing governmental structures that could preserve the empire's achievements while preparing for an uncertain future. Their work would determine whether the balance he had achieved between justice and power could become a permanent feature of human civilization, rather than merely the accident of one emperor's character. Standing to leave the garden, Gaius paused for a final look at Helena's memorial fountain. The shifting patterns of light seemed to form, for just a moment, the outline of a child asking questions about schools where learning was chosen rather than imposed. That child had grown into a man who had given his people both security and dignity. The question that would define his legacy was whether he could also give them a future where those gifts would endure, regardless of who wore the purple. The eagles were beginning their morning flight over the city below, their holographic wings catching the early sunlight as they traced patterns that spelled out SPQR across the Roman sky. Soon, citizens throughout the empire would wake to another day of unprecedented prosperity and freedom within order. But the emperor who had made that day possible was already working to ensure that tomorrow's citizens would inherit something even greater. A system of government that could evolve and endure, serving humanity's needs long after its creator had joined the ranks of history's remembered rulers. The transformation from conqueror's son to philosopher-emperor was nearly complete. What remained was the final test of his wisdom, creating a legacy that would survive the inevitable mortality of its architect. Chapter 10. The Uncertain Future. 20 years had passed since Gaius Justinian Aurelius first stood in the Pantheon and proclaimed the Edict of Rights. Now, on the anniversary of the empire's founding, he prepared to deliver what many suspected would be the most important speech of his reign. The Curia Nova had been expanded to accommodate not just the Imperial Congress, but representatives from every citizen council, advocacy office, and provincial assembly throughout the empire. For the first time in human history, a ruler would address a truly global audience that had genuine participation in their own governance. The transparent walls of the great chamber revealed crowds stretching beyond the horizon. Citizens who had traveled from every corner of the earth to witness this moment. They wore the diverse clothing of their regional cultures, but each garment bore the imperial purple thread that had become the universal symbol of shared citizenship. Children who had never known fear sat on their parents' shoulders, pointing excitedly at the holographic eagles that soared overhead in formations that spelled out words of unity in Latin, the empire's universal language, and the regional languages that were allowed to coexist with it. Dr. Sarah Chen, now 83, and confined to a hover chair but still sharp in mind and purpose, sat in the section reserved for senior advisors. Around her were the faces of people who had helped transform an empire of conquest into something unprecedented. A civilization that had learned to govern through consent, backed by overwhelming but precisely applied power. Representative Maria Santos, gray-haired but still passionate in her advocacy for citizen rights, caught Chen's eye and smiled a gesture that conveyed their shared amazement at how far they had all traveled from the dark days when resistance meant certain death and compliance meant barely tolerable survival. The emperor himself had changed in subtle ways that only those who had known him longest could detect. At 51, the genetic enhancements that preserved his physical youth could not disguise the weight of wisdom earned through 2 decades of absolute responsibility. His movements carried the measured dignity of someone who had learned that every gesture carried implications for billions of people, but his eyes still held the questioning intelligence that Helena had nurtured in a curious child. "Citizens of Rome," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems and simultaneously through every communication device in the empire. "Decades ago, my father stood in the original Pantheon and declared the restoration of an empire built on strength and order. Today, I stand before you to declare the evolution of that empire into something greater, a civilization built on strength and justice, order and freedom, power and responsibility." The applause that greeted these words was genuine and sustained, but Gaius raised his hand for silence. What he had to say next would test everything he had built and everything his citizens had learned to trust about their government. "The reforms we have implemented together have proven that democracy and empire need not be enemies, that the voice of the people can strengthen rather than weaken the foundations of effective governance. Our citizens enjoy freedoms that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors, while living in security that surpasses anything previously achieved in human history. He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the assembled representatives and the crowds beyond. Each face he saw carried the mark of the transformation he had overseen: confidence without arrogance, satisfaction without complacency, pride without the desperate edge that had characterized nationalism in the old world. Yet with these achievements comes a responsibility that extends beyond our own time, the emperor continued. The system we have built together must survive not just my reign, but the reigns of emperors yet to come. It must prove stronger than the character of any individual ruler, more enduring than the lifetime of any single generation. A murmur ran through the assembly as citizens began to sense that something momentous was about to be announced. Representative Santos leaned forward in her seat, her trained political instincts recognizing the tone of a leader preparing to make history. Therefore, I announce today the formal establishment of the Imperial Constitution, a document that will codify the rights you have earned and the responsibilities we all share in preserving this civilization. The emperor gestured, and holographic displays throughout the chamber began showing the text of a document that had been crafted in secret by the Constitutional Commission over the past 5 years. The Constitution was a masterwork of political engineering, balancing democratic participation with imperial authority in ways that would have seemed impossible to political theorists from the old world. It guaranteed the rights that citizens had come to cherish while preserving the centralized power that had made those rights possible. It established clear succession procedures that included input from the Imperial Congress, while maintaining the stability that came from ultimate executive authority. Most remarkably, it included mechanisms for its own evolution procedures, by which future generations could modify the system without destroying it, adapt to new circumstances without abandoning the principles that had made prosperity and freedom possible within imperial structure. This constitution does not limit imperial power, Gaius explained, as citizens throughout the empire read the document on their personal devices. Instead, it channels that power toward the service of all citizens, while ensuring that such service cannot be withdrawn by the whims of future rulers. It makes permanent the partnership between throne and people that has been the source of our shared success. Dr. Chen, reading the document with the careful attention of someone who had helped shape many of the policies it codified, was struck by how completely it embodied Helena's philosophy of governance through consent. The old teacher's influence could be traced through every article, every clause that protected citizen dignity while preserving imperial unity. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the Constitution was its final article, a provision that would allow future generations to choose their own governmental structure if they could demonstrate that an alternative system would better serve human flourishing. It was a clause that effectively acknowledged that even the perfected empire might someday need to evolve into something entirely different. I offer you this constitution not as a gift from ruler to subject, but as a compact between partners in the great work of human civilization, the emperor declared. Your representatives will have 6 months to debate its provisions, suggest modifications, and ultimately vote on its ratification. If approved, it will bind not just me, but every emperor who follows to the principles we have discovered together. The implications of this announcement rippled through the assembly like waves through still water. Citizens were being asked not merely to accept rights granted from above, but to participate in creating the fundamental structure of their government. It was democracy of a sort that had never existed before, not the chaotic rule of majorities that had characterized the old world, but the ordered participation of citizens who understood both the possibilities and the responsibilities of genuine self-governance. Representative James Aurelius, now a senior figure in the Imperial Congress despite his youth, rose to address the emperor directly. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had grown up believing that his opinions mattered, "this constitution represents everything we have hoped for. The institutionalization of the partnership between citizen and empire that has made our civilization possible. But I must ask, what happens if future emperors choose to ignore these limitations? What enforcement mechanisms exist beyond the honor of rulers?" It was the question that had kept Gaius awake during many of his pre-dawn reflections, and his answer revealed the depth of thought that had gone into the Constitutional Commission's work. "The ultimate enforcement mechanism," he replied, "is the same force that has always determined the fate of governments, the consent of the governed. This constitution creates structures that make imperial rule dependent on citizen satisfaction in ways that cannot be easily circumvented. An emperor who violates its provisions will find himself ruling over a population that has both the legal right and the practical means to withdraw their cooperation. The Constitution included provisions for citizen assemblies that could be convened in response to imperial violations, economic mechanisms that would make tyrannical rule practically impossible to sustain, and information systems that would make it difficult for future rulers to hide abuses from public scrutiny. Most importantly, it created a culture of expectation that would make constitutional government seem natural rather than revolutionary to future generations. As the formal ceremony concluded and citizens began the long journey back to their homes throughout the empire, conversations erupted in Latin and every language and dialect spoken by humanity. The debates that would shape the next 6 months had already begun, with citizens discussing not whether to accept the Constitution, but how to improve it. In a small tavern in Neo-Cologne, Klaus Weber, the factory owner whose case against General Severus had helped establish the principle of citizen rights, raised his glass in a toast that would be repeated in countless variations throughout the empire. "To the emperor who taught us that we could be both Roman and free," he declared to his companions, "and to the Constitution that will ensure our children inherit both gifts." But even as citizens celebrated, some voices expressed the careful hopes that had been whispered in private for years. In Londinium, a group of teachers gathered to discuss what one of them quietly described as the next logical step. "The Constitution is magnificent," said Margaret Thornton, a citizen educator whose grandmother had remembered the old British Parliament. "But I wonder, in perhaps another generation or two, whether we might see the creation of something even more remarkable. A system where the people themselves choose their highest leaders, where democracy becomes not just a voice in governance, but the source of governmental authority itself." Her companions nodded thoughtfully, but quickly added the disclaimers that had become ritual whenever such ideas were discussed. "Of course, that's purely hypothetical," said another teacher. "Whatever His Majesty and his successors decide will surely be wisdom. We're simply grateful for the freedoms we have, and whatever additional ones they might choose to grant." The conversation continued in this careful balance between hope and loyalty that had characterized imperial political discourse for 2 decades. Citizens dreamed of greater democracy while acknowledging that such dreams depended entirely on imperial benevolence. They spoke of constitutional monarchy and popular sovereignty in theoretical terms that carefully avoided any suggestion of disloyalty to the current system. Dr. Chen, making her way slowly through the crowds returning to their homes, paused to watch a group of children playing in one of the city's parks. They had organized themselves into a mock imperial congress, electing representatives and debating imaginary policies with the seriousness that only children could bring to games that mirrored the adult world. What struck her most powerfully was that these children saw nothing contradictory about being both democratic participants and loyal imperial citizens. They had been raised in a system where those identities reinforced rather than conflicted with each other. For them, The empire was not a force that constrained their freedom, but the framework that made freedom possible. One child, a girl of perhaps 10, who had been elected speaker of their miniature assembly, was addressing her playmates with remarkable eloquence. "The empire protects us," she declared, "so we can protect each other. The emperor gives us the right to choose, so we must choose wisely. When we grow up, we'll make the empire even better than it is today." As evening fell over the capital, the holographic eagles began their nightly display. But tonight, their formations were different. Instead of spelling out SPQR, they traced the opening words of the Constitution. "We, the citizens of Rome, in partnership with our emperor, establish this compact to secure the blessings of order and liberty for ourselves and our posterity." The words hung in the sky like a promise, visible from every corner of the city and transmitted to every province of the empire. Citizens looked up at them with expressions that would have been impossible decades earlier, not the careful neutrality of subjects avoiding notice, but the engaged interest of partners in governance reading the terms of their own political future. The emperor himself watched the display from his private balcony. Helena's journals open beside him, to the passage he returned to whenever the weight of the future seemed most daunting. The greatest gift a ruler can give his people is not perfect government, but the capacity for self-governance. The highest achievement of any empire is not permanent dominance, but the creation of citizens worthy of eventual freedom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the constitutional debates began in earnest. Citizens would discover that meaningful participation in governance required wisdom, patience, and the ability to compromise lessons that would prepare them for even greater responsibilities in the decades to come. The empire would continue to evolve, guided by the partnership between imperial authority and citizen engagement that had become its defining characteristic. The transformation that had begun with a young prince questioning the nature of power had culminated in a civilization that had learned to balance strength with justice, order with freedom, tradition with progress. Citizens throughout the empire slept that night with dreams of a future that seemed not just secure, but filled with possibilities they had helped create. The eagles soared through the darkness, their wings carrying both the weight of history and the lightness of hope. The empire endured, but it was no longer simply enduring. It was becoming something new, something that had never existed before, a form of government that could satisfy both the human need for security and the human desire for dignity. Whether that evolution would continue toward the type of constitutional monarchy that citizens whispered about in careful tones, or take some entirely different direction, remained unwritten in the stars. But for the first time since the conquest, the future felt like something that belonged to the people themselves, rather than something that would be imposed upon them by forces beyond their control. The new Caesar had given his subjects the greatest gift any ruler could offer, the gradual transformation from subjects into citizens, and from citizens into partners in the eternal work of human civilization. The rest of the story would be written by the people themselves, guided by the institutions he had created and the principles he had taught them to value. The Roman Empire lived on, but it lived now in a form that even its original creators could never have imagined. Not as the dominion of the few over the many, but as the shared project of all humanity working together to create a civilization worthy of their highest aspirations.